Imagine standing at the edge of the world. Not at the edge of a cliff. Not at the edge of some mountain ridge with wind in your face and a valley below. Something far stranger than that. Something so vast, so deep, so profoundly silent that your mind can barely hold the picture together. Imagine standing at the rim of what is now the Mediterranean Sea, except there is no sea, there is no water, there is no blue horizon, there is no salt spray on the wind. There is nothing down there except distance. An enormous cathedral-like emptiness that stretches for more than 1,500 miles in every direction, sinking down and down and down to a floor nearly 3 miles below your feet. A canyon so deep it makes the Grand Canyon look like a shallow ditch. A silence so complete and so total that you could stand there for hours without hearing a single sound that a human being made. This place existed. This is not mythology. This is not a story someone invented to explain the stars or the seasons. The empty Mediterranean basin, a world without a sea, was real. It was dry land. It had weather and wind and shadows. It had creatures walking through it. It had in some ways a kind of terrible alien beauty that no living human will ever see again. And here is the question that makes this so extraordinary. What happened when it came back? Because it did come back. The Mediterranean Sea did not always exist in its current form. It vanished once, drained away over geological time like water out of a bathtub, leaving behind salt flats and canyons and isolated lakes and a stillness that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. And then one day, in geological terms, almost literally one day, the Atlantic Ocean broke through a narrow gap at what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, and the water came. Not as a gentle trickle, not as a slow rise over centuries. What came was something the Earth had perhaps never seen before, and may never see again. A flood so enormous, so sustained, so incomprehensibly powerful, that scientists who study it still struggle to find words that do it justice. It filled the entire Mediterranean basin, all 965,000 square miles of it, in somewhere between a few hundred years and a few thousand years, which in geological terms is as close to instantaneous as anything can be. And during all the time before that flood, during all those long windswept, sun-baked thousands of years when the basin was dry, life continued. The world kept turning. Animals walked the salt flats. Early ancestors of ours, creatures walking upright on 2 legs, moved through landscapes that no longer exist, under skies that looked exactly like ours, breathing air that was just as real as the air you are breathing right now. That is what we are going to explore tonight. Not a dramatic retelling, not a breathless countdown to catastrophe. Tonight we are going to do something quieter and stranger and, in its own way, more beautiful than that. We are going to walk through the lost world of the empty Mediterranean. We are going to feel the heat of it, the silence of it, the scale of it. We are going to meet the creatures that lived in its depths and on its edges. We are going to sit beside fires that burned in places that are now thousands of feet below the surface of a sea. And we are going to watch, slowly and peacefully, as the world that existed before the flood slipped away, not with terror, but with a kind of quiet inevitability, the way all things eventually give way to whatever comes next. So settle in. Let your breathing slow down. This is a story that has been waiting to be told for more than 5 million years. And tonight, for the next 2 hours, it belongs to you. Let the world outside go quiet. Let your thoughts settle. We are going back further back than most stories ever dare to go. We are going back to a time before the sea. Picture this. It is somewhere around 6 million years ago. The Earth is still recognizable. The continents are in roughly the positions they occupy today. The sun rises and sets in the same ancient rhythm. The stars wheel overhead in patterns that would look familiar to any astronomer. But something is missing from the map of the world that no modern person has ever seen missing. Something so large and so fundamental that its absence changes everything about the climate of an entire region. The Mediterranean Sea is gone. Not gone as in dried up in the way a puddle dries in summer. Gone in the fullest possible sense. What remains is a landscape more comparable to the surface of another planet than to anything you could walk through today. A vast basin, larger than the entire contiguous United States east of the Mississippi River, scooped out of the crust of the earth to depths that stagger the imagination. In the deepest parts of what we now call the central Mediterranean, the basin floor lies more than 15,000 feet below sea level. That is nearly 3 miles of empty air, of dizzying vertical distance between where the water surface would one day be and the pale, salt-crusted floor below. For scale, the deepest point of the Grand Canyon is about 6,000 feet below the rim. The empty Mediterranean basin, at its most extreme, goes more than twice that deep, and it is not a single narrow gorge. It spreads across an area the size of a continent, with mountain ranges running through it like spines, with deep sub-basins like separate rooms in an enormous house, with cliffs and ridgelines and valley floors that were, in those ancient days, open to the sky and full of wind. How did this happen? The Mediterranean Sea, geologically speaking, lives or dies based on a single geographic detail, the connection between it and the Atlantic Ocean at what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, in the far western corner of the basin. The Mediterranean is nearly landlocked. It has no rivers large enough to fill it. The rain that falls over it is not nearly enough to replace what it loses to evaporation in the heat of the long southern summers. Without a continuous supply of Atlantic water flowing in through that narrow western gateway, the Mediterranean would drain in roughly 1,000 years. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but not much more than that. And around 6 million years ago, that gateway closed. The tectonic plates that carry Africa and Europe had been slowly, incrementally grinding against each other for millions of years. The African plate was pushing northward, and somewhere in the region of what is now Morocco and southern Spain, the land masses on either side of the ancient seaway simply rose, the seafloor lifted, the connection narrowed, the current slowed. And then, sometime around 5.96 million years ago, give or take, the connection closed entirely. What followed is called the Messinian salinity crisis, a name that sounds almost comically dry for something so immense, because what actually followed was this. The Mediterranean began to evaporate. Slowly at first, barely measurably, the level dropped, then faster still. For thousands of years, under the beating sun of subtropical latitudes, the water retreated. What had been open sea became shallow brine. What had been shallow brine became salt flat. The edges of the basin dried first, leaving white crusts of halite and gypsum, minerals that precipitated out of the shrinking water the way salt rings form around an old glass. The deeper parts held out longer, drawing in what remained of the shrinking water mass, becoming ever saltier, ever more extreme, until they too were reduced to nothing or to something very close to it. What remained was not a single unified emptiness. The basin fractured into a collection of environments as varied as they were strange. In the deepest regions, where pressure and heat and the last concentrated remnants of brine pooled together, there were lakes. Not the kinds of lakes you might imagine, clear and cool and surrounded by trees, but something altogether more alien. Lakes so salty that almost nothing could live in them. Lakes with surfaces that glittered white in the midday sun, reflecting a sky that had never looked so close to anyone standing on the basin floor. Lakes surrounded by salt formations, pillars and domes and crystalline structures that grew slowly upward from the floor like the architecture of another world. Between these isolated bodies of water, the landscape that stretched for hundreds of miles was one of the most extreme environments on Earth. In summer, the floor of the empty basin would have been ferociously hot. Air temperatures in the deepest parts may have exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than Death Valley, hotter than the surface of the Sahara, a heat so intense that it would have been fatal to most large animals caught in it without shelter. The air down there was also denser than anywhere else on Earth at the time. compressed by the enormous depth of the atmospheric column pressing down from above, a strange physical consequence of being so far below sea level. In winter, the temperature swings were dramatic. The same deep basin that cooked in summer could turn cold at night. The thin, desiccated air, unable to hold warmth once the sun went down, temperatures dropping in ways that would have been disorienting to anything evolved for a normal climate. And yet, for all its extremity, the basin was not lifeless. Along its edges, on the terraced slopes and gentler gradients that descended from what are now the coastal mountains of Italy, Spain, France, North Africa, Greece, and Turkey, life persisted. There were rivers. The great rivers of Europe and North Africa, the ancestors of the Rhone, the Nile, the Po, the Ebro, did not stop flowing when the sea disappeared. They simply followed the new gradient, cutting deeper and deeper into the sediments as the base level dropped, carving enormous canyon systems into the edges of the basin. The Rhone, which today flows through southern France and empties into the Mediterranean near Marseille, was during this period one of the longest rivers on Earth, or at least its effective canyon extended deep into what is now the seafloor, carrying fresh water thousands of feet below the contemporary sea level. Where these rivers descended into the basin, they spread out into deltas, and where they spread, they brought something the basin desperately needed: fresh water. Around these river mouths, green things grew. Not forests exactly. The climate was too arid for the lush Mediterranean vegetation we know today, but scrubby, hardy, drought-adapted plant communities. Tamarisk and juniper and wild olive and grasses, with roots deep enough to find moisture in the baked soil. Enough green, enough shade, enough water seeping through the soil to support animals. And where animals could survive, they did. Imagine standing on a ridge somewhere in what would much later be called Italy, looking out over this. The ridge beneath your feet is unremarkable, a slope of pale limestone with scattered herbs and dry grasses, the kind of place you might walk through without giving it a second glance. But the view from here is unlike anything that exists in the modern world. The land drops away in front of you, not gradually, not in gentle hills, but steeply and dramatically, terracing down through eroded ridges and shadow-filled gulches, falling and falling into a distance so vast and so deep that the far wall of the basin, the mountains of what would later be called North Africa, sits at the visible limit of the horizon, and yet is itself 1,000 feet below where you stand. The air is dry. It always is. A faint breeze moves across the slopes, carrying with it the smell of salt and heated rock, the thin perfume of the few herbs that manage to grow in this sparse, honest soil. The sky overhead is enormous and pale, bleached by altitude and heat into a dome of almost white blue, with a sun so fierce and so direct that shadows are knife-edged and brief. Below, far below, the basin floor is a shimmer. You can see it from up here if you know where to look. A pale, flat brightness where the salt flats begin, glittering in the afternoon light with the particular cold fire of crystallized minerals baking in the heat. In the very center of your field of vision, if you squint, you can just make out the dark surface of one of the deep residual lakes, a still, reflective pool roughly the size of a small sea, its waters so concentrated with dissolved minerals that almost nothing lives in them. Their surface so still that they mirror the sky above them with perfect, unbroken clarity. There is no sound from down there. The basin floor is too far, too deep, too separated from the slopes above to send its sounds upward. The only things you can hear up here are what the ridge itself offers. The dry rustle of grass in the wind, the click of a small lizard navigating rocks, the distant cry of a bird riding a thermal somewhere overhead. You could stand here for an hour without seeing another large animal. The landscape feels immense and attentive and absolutely indifferent to your presence in the way that only very old places can. This is the empty Mediterranean. This is what the world looked like before the sea came back. And this is where our story begins. A few miles along the ridge from where we were standing, the slope gentles out into a broader plateau before dropping again toward one of those deep river canyons. And here, in the shade of a limestone overhang, where the rock has cracked and tilted over thousands of years of freeze and thaw, something has been moving since before dawn. They are not human, not exactly. Not in the way we use that word today, with all its weight of language and culture and consciousness. But they are not entirely unlike us either. They walk upright, their hands are free when they move. Their eyes, dark and alert, track movement with the same quick attention that a good hunter has always needed. They are small. The tallest among them stands perhaps 4.5 feet, and lean, built for a life that requires constant movement and constant awareness. Their faces are closer to ours than to any other creature's, though the brow ridge is heavier, the jaw broader, the brain case smaller. They are what we were millions of years ago, in that long in-between time when our lineage had separated from our closest relatives, but had not yet become the thing we are now. Call them what they were, early hominids, our ancestors in the deepest, most literal sense. The great-great-grandparents of our great-great-grandparents in a lineage so long it disappears into geological time. They had been living along the edges of the empty basin for generations, hundreds of generations, maybe thousands, moving with the seasons, following the water sources, adapting in their own slow, cumulative way to the strange and extreme world that the disappearing sea had left behind. Their day begins before the sun comes fully over the ridge. The morning, in this dry and ancient place, is the best part. The air still holds the coolness of the night, not the deep, lingering cold of a winter morning, but a gentle reprieve, a few hours of tolerable temperature before the sun climbs high enough to make movement genuinely dangerous in the unshaded areas. This is when they move. From the overhang where they sheltered through the night, a small group of them, perhaps 8 or 10 adults, with a handful of younger ones moving among them, begins to spread out across the plateau. Their movements are unhurried but purposeful, the unhurried purposefulness of creatures who have been doing this particular thing for so long that it has become as natural as breathing. They know this plateau. They know every crack in the limestone where water might pool after rain. They know which plants flower in which season, which roots are edible before they harden, which berries can be eaten now, and which must wait another week. They carry this knowledge the way we carry the layout of our own houses, without thinking, without consulting anything, drawing on it automatically as the morning progresses. The youngest ones stay close to the adults who carried them through the night. Not out of fear, exactly, though fear is always present, a low, constant background hum in a landscape that has its own predators, but out of something older and simpler than fear. Proximity is warmth. Proximity is safety. Proximity is the most fundamental thing any social animal understands. One of the older individuals, a female, slightly grey at the temples, moves to a particular spot on the plateau that she knows well. Beneath a flat stone. She has visited this place before, enough times that the stone itself has been shifted slightly by the digging of hands around it. She squats, her feet planted flat on the ground in the way that upright walkers instinctively rest, and begins to work at the soil beside the stone. Her hands are efficient and practiced. After a few minutes of careful excavation, she extracts a root pale, swollen with stored water, fibrous but edible. She bites into one end, chews thoughtfully, and passes the rest to the young one who has been watching from 2 feet away. It is a small thing, a morning routine, the kind of unremarkable domestic act that barely registers in the sweep of deep history. And yet there is something in it, something in the gesture of sharing, in the knowledge brought to a particular rock in a particular spot on a particular morning that is recognizable across 5 million years. Something that reaches forward through all the time between then and now and lands quietly in the present. Meanwhile, others in the group are ranging further. 2 younger males have moved toward the lip of the canyon, where the river below has carved a route that, if you follow it carefully, picking your way down the terraced ledges, leads to water, real water. Not the salt-crusted residue of an evaporating lake, but a thin, bright thread of fresh river water running along the canyon floor, cold even in summer because it comes from high snowfields in the mountains far to the north. They know this route, the way you know the route from your bedroom to the kitchen in the dark, by feel, by memory, by a body knowledge that doesn't require thought. The descent takes almost an hour. The canyon walls rise around them as they move lower, the temperature climbing with each 100 feet they drop, the sky narrowing to a strip of pale blue directly overhead. The river, when they reach it, is nothing dramatic. Shin-deep, clear, moving with a quiet urgency over rounded stones. But the sound of it, after the dry silence of the plateau above, is extraordinary. Water, moving water, the sound that all land-living creatures are wired, at the deepest biological level, to respond to with something close to relief. They drink, they stand in the shallows and let the cold move around their feet. One of them dunks his face briefly, comes up streaming. They are not hurrying. The canyon is shaded at this hour, the walls blocking the direct sun, making the temperature down here almost pleasant. There are plants along the riverbank, real plants, green and dense by the standards of the dry world above, and among them a source of edible material, seeds, small fruits, insects. The riverbank is the richest ecological zone in this whole desiccated landscape, the place where the most variety of food sources concentrates. They gather what they can carry without bags or containers, and this is one of the fundamental limitations of their world, a limitation so obvious to them that it doesn't register as a limitation at all. They are not, at this point in their story, making baskets or clay pots or carrying vessels of any kind. What they can take from a place is what they can carry in their hands, in their mouths, perhaps cupped against the body. It means that abundance at the river cannot easily be transported back to the plateau, cannot be stored, cannot be accumulated. It means they must keep returning. It means their lives have a rhythm dictated entirely by the landscape. Move to where the resource is, use what is there. Move on. This is not poverty. Let that thought settle for a moment. We tend to look at a life structured this way, with no storage, no agriculture, no accumulated goods, and see it through the lens of what we have, and conclude that they must have suffered from what they lacked. But that is not how they experienced it. If they experienced anything in a way we could recognize as such, they were not comparing themselves to a future they could not imagine. They had no concept of what was missing. They had instead a profound and intimate knowledge of the world they lived in, a knowledge so granular and so embedded in the body that it functioned as its own kind of abundance. They knew the canyon, they knew the plateau, they knew the terraced slopes between the two, and the direction in which to travel to find each of the water sources they depended on, and the approximate time of year when each source would be at its best. They knew which predators moved through which territories, which hours of the day were safe for moving in the open, and which called for stillness and waiting. They knew the sounds of their landscape the way a musician knows the notes of a piece they have played 10,000 times, not intellectually, but bodily, preconsciously, as a form of listening that operates below the level of deliberate thought. This is something worth sitting with. We have, over the long centuries of civilization, traded a great deal of that immediate, embodied knowledge for a different kind of knowledge accumulated, written down, transmitted across time and space without requiring direct experience. We know things that no single human could ever learn in a lifetime of direct observation. But in exchanging one kind of knowing for another, we have also lost something, a quietness, a presence. The capacity to stand in a landscape and understand it as a complete and living thing without needing to translate that understanding into words. The small group at the river does not struggle with this. They have no other mode. The canyon is not scenery to them. It is a living document, and they are fluent in it. By the time the sun has climbed to its midpoint in the sky, the canyon floor is no longer comfortable. The shade has retreated. The rock walls are radiating stored heat like enormous ovens. The water is still cool, but the air above it has become oppressive. This is the signal not thought, not decided, but felt that it is time to move back upward, to find shade, to rest through the worst of the heat. The climb back to the plateau is harder than the descent. Sweat dries almost immediately in the arid air. The limestone underfoot is hot enough to feel through the thick soles of well-traveled feet. They move without rushing, finding their path by the same body knowledge that brought them down, pausing now and then in patches of shade cast by overhanging rock to let the internal temperature drop slightly before continuing. By the time the full group reassembles in and around the overhang, the foragers from the plateau, the river travelers, the ones who stayed behind with the youngest, the midday heat is at its peak. And they do what any sensible creature does in this heat, in this landscape, at this hour. They rest. Not the restlessness of a modern person lying on a bed with a phone, mind moving through 100 unfinished thoughts. Not even the ordinary rest of someone who has had a busy morning and wants to unwind. They rest the way animals rest fully, without apology, without the feeling that they should be doing something else. Some of them sleep. Others sit in the shade with their backs against the warm rock, eyes half closed, watching the distance with the relaxed attention of creatures who are simultaneously off duty and never entirely off guard. Grooming happens. Hands moving through hair, a kind of social touching that carries its own meaning, a language of proximity and trust. It is profoundly quiet. The wind has died down in the middle of the day, as it often does in this landscape. The insects that chirped through the morning have gone still in the heat. The birds that are visible at this hour are the ones that ride thermals, spiraling upward in wide, lazy circles without apparent effort, their wings spread and motionless, trusting the hot air to carry them. If you could sit beside these resting creatures and watch them through the long heat of the afternoon, and imagine for a moment that you could, the thing that would strike you most, after all the obvious differences of size and face and behavior, is how familiar the stillness looks, how human the posture of rest. Because it is. If you are drifting off as you listen, that is exactly the point. If you are finding this kind of slow, ancient storytelling restful, then please, when you wake up tomorrow, consider giving this a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps more people find their way here, and it keeps these long, quiet journeys into the past coming, now back to the dry basin, back to the afternoon quiet. As the heat begins its slow retreat, which in this part of the world takes its time, the sun still fierce, even when it has begun to drop toward the western ridgeline, the group stirs again, slowly, one at a time. The transition from rest to activity has no sharp edge. The afternoon is when the deeper social life of the group unfolds, if such a grand phrase can be applied to interactions that proceed without language as we know it, without planning, without narrative. But there is something happening among them that deserves the word social, for lack of anything more precise. There is play among the young chasing and tumbling and the small contests of physical testing that build bodies and establish the kinds of subtle relationship that will matter for years. There is contact between adults, the sustained proximity of individuals who find each other's company preferable to solitude, who choose without deciding to sit near this one rather than that one, who respond to sounds from across the group with looks and small movements that carry information. There is, in other words, a community. Small, and by modern standards perhaps incomprehensibly sparse in its complexity, but real. A web of relationships, of familiarity, of shared history that goes back through generations, that connects each individual to every other through bonds of kin and habit and shared experience. And they are doing this, living this small, dense, ancient community life in a landscape that will not exist again. The slopes of the empty Mediterranean basin, the terraced cliffs above a vanished sea. A world that the modern human mind can barely picture, built on a scale so different from anything in our daily experience that it requires a kind of imaginative patience to hold. The afternoon moves, the shadows lengthen. The color of the light shifts from the flat white of high noon to the gold and amber of late afternoon, which picks out the textures of the limestone and turns the distant salt flats below into something that, for just this hour, looks almost beautiful. The group moves again as the temperature drops to something manageable, foraging for another hour or two, the second productive period of the day, shorter than the morning, more about gathering what's easily at hand than about the longer expeditions of earlier hours. And then, as the light begins to fail in earnest, they return to the overhang, the familiar place. The place that, if they have a concept of home, is the closest thing to it. The day is ending, and the night of the dry world is about to begin. Not everything in the empty basin was as stark as the salt flats at its center, or as arid as the high plateau margins. The world of the dry Mediterranean, for all its extremity, was not uniform. And in the places where water found a way, where the physics of the landscape created pockets of relative moisture, where springs bubbled up through limestone formations, where ancient lake deposits still held enough moisture to support something green, there were ecosystems that were genuinely strange. Not strange in the way the word is used loosely as a synonym for unusual, strange in the precise sense, assemblages of living things that could not have existed anywhere else on Earth because the conditions that created them were found nowhere else. Consider the lakes. Several isolated bodies of water survived in the deepest parts of the Mediterranean basin throughout the long dry period. They were remnants, the last concentrated remains of the sea that had been. As the waters evaporated, the minerals dissolved in them became more and more concentrated, the way brine thickens as salt water is reduced. The lakes that remained were far saltier than any modern ocean. In some of them, the salt concentration was approaching the saturation point, the level at which no more salt could physically dissolve, at which the water itself was becoming a kind of liquid crystal. In these extreme lakes, normal life was impossible. Fish could not survive. Aquatic plants could not grow. The food chains that sustain ordinary lake ecosystems had nowhere to begin. But life is remarkably persistent. In the most extreme of these ancient salt lakes, places that geologists now identify through the mineral deposits they left behind in the seafloor sediments, specialized microorganisms found ways to exist. Ancient relatives of the bacteria that still live today in salt evaporation ponds, in the Dead Sea, in the hypersaline lakes of Antarctica. These were among the most salt-tolerant life forms on Earth, and in the concentrated remnant waters of the vanished Mediterranean, they found a world that, for all its harshness, was theirs. They colored the water. In some of these ancient salt lakes, as in their modern equivalents, the presence of salt-loving microorganisms would have turned the water itself, strange shades, pinks and reds and oranges, the pigments in the organism's membranes absorbing and reflecting light in ways that made the lakes look, from any distance, almost luminous. A deep red lake in the middle of a pale salt desert, reflecting a cloudless sky. It would have looked, if any human eye had been there to see it, like something from a dream. Around the margins of these extreme lakes, on the slightly less salty ground, where the salt concentration fell just below lethal, there was another zone, a thin ring of life clinging to the edge of the impossible. Salt-tolerant plants, the kind we now call halophytes, grew in sparse, grey-green mats along the shoreline. Glasswort, sea purslane, tamarisk, plants with mechanisms for managing the salt that would kill most vegetation, pumping it into specialized cells, excreting it through their leaves, keeping their internal chemistry balanced against an environment that was trying constantly to draw the moisture out of them. Where these plants grew, insects followed. Where insects concentrated, birds followed the insects. And so, even at the very edge of the most extreme environments in the basin, there was a food web, sparse, unusual, unlike anything in the ordinary world above, but real and functioning. Further from the salt lake margins in the broader interior of the basin, the landscape was dominated by what geologists call evaporites, minerals deposited by the evaporating seawater over the course of the long drying period. Enormous formations of gypsum and halite, some of them hundreds of feet thick, covering the basin floor in a layer that in places looked more like a frozen snowfield than a geological formation. White and pale grey and faintly iridescent, cracking in geometric patterns under the thermal stress of extreme temperature swings between day and night. Nothing large lived in the center of this zone, but on its edges where the evaporite deposits gave way to softer sediments, where wind-blown dust had accumulated and the first thin soils were beginning to form, there were communities of plants and the animals that depended on them. Drought-adapted grasses with root systems that reached down many feet into the sediment, searching for any trace of moisture. Succulent plants with thick, water-storing leaves. Insects that spent most of their lives in dormant states, activating only after rare rains, completing their entire life cycles in the brief windows when the landscape offered enough moisture. The animals that moved through the broader basin, the ones big enough to be seen without a microscope, were travelers more than residents. They came from the margins, from the better watered slopes and canyon systems at the edges, moving into the interior during the cooler months when the heat was manageable, retreating again when summer turned the basin floor into something close to uninhabitable. There were horses, not the modern horse, but a smaller, stockier ancestor, an animal built for covering ground on hard, arid terrain. They moved through the interior in small groups, grazing the sparse grass with a patience that comes from long evolutionary experience with lean landscapes. Their teeth were specialized for this high ground, built to grind the abrasive grasses of dry country, able to extract nutrition from forage that would have been worthless to less well-adapted grazers. There were early relatives of the elephant, smaller than modern elephants perhaps, but unmistakably elephantine, with the same basic body plan, the same general intelligence, the same social complexity. They needed more water than horses did, and so their movements were governed more tightly by the distribution of springs and river systems. But elephants are extraordinary walkers, capable of covering enormous distances in search of resources, and the basin, despite its harshness, had enough scattered water sources that they could move through it seasonally. There were predators. Of course there were predators. Anywhere large herbivores move, the predators follow, because large herbivores are the most concentrated source of energy in any landscape. The cats that moved through the margins of the Mediterranean basin were not entirely familiar to a modern eye, different species, different proportions than their living descendants, though built on the same basic predatory blueprint. Ambush hunters, solitary, patience, capable of remaining completely motionless for extraordinary lengths of time, waiting for the moment when a horse or a young elephant strayed far enough from the group to be taken, and birds, always birds. The skies over the dry basin were, in some ways, richer in bird life than anything that lives in the same region today, because birds are more mobile than any ground-based creature and can exploit scattered resources across enormous distances in ways that land animals simply cannot. Eagles that could see a moving animal from a mile away. Storks and herons following the river courses into the basin. Vultures spiraling on thermals so high they were barely visible, their eyes locked on the ground below with an attention that never entirely switched off. The rivers themselves, threading down from the surrounding highlands into the basin, supported their own complete ecosystems, freshwater environments that existed in a kind of paradox, pouring their cold, clear water into a landscape so arid that it felt almost obscene. The canyon rivers had fish. They had freshwater mussels. They had aquatic insects and amphibians, and the specialized plants that grow in moving watercress, river sedge, the dangling roots of trees that had colonized the banks. In these river corridors, life was dense and diverse and loud in a way that the surrounding landscape never was. The contrast between the silent, baked plateau above and the sound-filled, humid microworld of a river canyon just a few hundred feet below was startling. And it was in this river corridor world in particular that our early hominid ancestors spent a significant portion of their time. There is a reason for that. There are actually several reasons. Water, obviously. Food diversity. The river margins offered a much greater variety of edible plants and animals than the dry scrub above. But there was also something else. The river canyons offered shelter, overhangs and caves carved by water into the limestone walls, natural structures that blocked wind and held warmth, that provided a ceiling against rain and shade against the worst of the sun. They offered visibility. The canyon walls rising on either side meant fewer directions from which a predator could approach unseen. And they offered something subtler, a sense of place, of bounded territory, of a location with clear physical features that could be learned and remembered and returned to. The canyon of a particular river, somewhere in what is now southern Europe or North Africa, was the closest thing to a home landscape that these creatures had. Not a home in the sense of a built structure, not a house or a village, but a known geography. A web of familiar features, this overhang, this spring, this bend in the river, this particular rock formation that marks where the path widens, that organize their world the way walls organize a room. They knew this landscape, and in knowing it, they were, in the most fundamental sense, connected to it. The strange ecosystems of the dry Mediterranean, the salt lakes and the evaporite plains and the river canyons and the sparse margin vegetation were not backdrop. They were the substance of the world these early creatures lived inside. The landscape shaped them as surely as they, in their small way, shaped the landscape, wearing paths into the soil, dispersing seeds, creating disturbances that opened opportunities for new growth. It was an interconnection so deep and so ancient that it looks from this distance almost like belonging. And there is one more thing about the strange ecosystems of the dry basin that deserves a moment before we move on. Something that is easy to overlook when we focus on the drama of extreme environments. The salt lakes, the evaporite plains, the canyon rivers. Something quieter and, in its own way, more significant. Silence. The empty Mediterranean basin was one of the quietest places that has ever existed on Earth. Not the silence of an anechoic chamber, an artificial absence of sound that is deeply unsettling to most people, that the brain interprets as something wrong, a natural silence. The silence of a landscape that has very little to say. The sparse vegetation that clung to the basin margins rustled in the wind, but there was not enough of it to create the constant, layered conversation of a forest. The rivers in their canyons contributed a low, continuous murmur that barely carried beyond the canyon walls. The animals were too sparsely distributed to fill the air with the kind of biological noise that a meadow or a jungle generates by the sheer density of its inhabitants. In the center of the basin, on the vast salt flats, in the mineral deserts between the scattered remnant lakes, the silence was so profound that sound itself seemed to behave differently. The lack of vegetation meant the lack of one of the primary surfaces that breaks sound up, absorbs some frequencies and reflects others, creates the dimensional acoustic texture that makes most landscapes sound like themselves rather than like empty rooms. The salt flats were hard and flat, and almost perfectly reflective, which meant that any sound that did occur, a rock falling, an animal's footstep travelled further than it should have, and arrived at the ear with an unusual clarity, stripped of the dampening that normal ground cover provides. This is not something we can hear. We were not there. But we can imagine it in the way we imagine all things that are over. A vast, salt-white plain, perhaps 30 miles across, an afternoon in the deep dry time, a hot wind from the south carrying dust. And underneath all of that, underneath the wind, underneath the distant sound of the thermal currents moving, underneath even the almost inaudible ticking of the mineral surface contracting or expanding, a silence, so complete and so old that it seems to have weight. That silence was the Mediterranean for hundreds of thousands of years. It will not be silent for much longer. The day ends differently down here than it does at sea level. Up on the plateau, at the rim of the basin, sunset arrives with a kind of theatricality, the sky going through its progressions of colour, the shadow of the ridge advancing across the landscape below, the temperature dropping sharply as the direct sun disappears, and the thin, dry air releases its heat rapidly into the cloudless sky above. But down on the basin floor itself, night arrives in stages. The canyon walls cut off the direct sunlight long before the sky overhead has stopped glowing. The river corridor falls into shadow while the upper plateau is still fully lit. The contrast between bright above and dim below creating a strange in-between hour when the world seems suspended between two states. The hominids who spend most of their time along the canyon margins know this well. The shift from light to shadow on the canyon walls is as reliable a signal as any clock, and it marks a transition as clear in their world as any formal boundary. The day is ending. The configurations of safety and danger are shifting. The predators that rest through the hottest hours of the day, the big cats that prefer the cooler activity windows of dawn and dusk, will soon be moving. The group consolidates. The ones who have been ranging wider through the afternoon return to the overhang, drawn by something that functions like habit but runs deeper than habit. The young ones who were playing at the edge of the group pull closer to the adults. The quality of the sounds being made changes, louder, more frequent, more textured, as though the group is reassembling itself not just physically but socially. Reconnecting through vocalizations the way you might reconnect with someone after a day apart through conversation. And there is fire. How early hominids first learned to use fire, and when exactly in the evolutionary sequence this happened, is one of the questions that archaeologists and paleoanthropologists debate most vigorously. The earliest definitive evidence for controlled fire use dates to somewhere around 1 million years ago, associated with Homo erectus sites in Africa. But there are hints, contested and fragmentary, of fire use much earlier than that. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the use of fire, even if only the opportunistic use of naturally occurring fire rather than the deliberate making of it, was a behavior that our ancestors were developing in exactly this period of deep time, in exactly these kinds of landscapes. In the dry Mediterranean basin, natural fire sources were not hard to find. Lightning struck the dry vegetation on the plateau margins and started fires that could burn for days. Volcanic activity, still significant in parts of the Mediterranean region during this period, produced lava flows and gas vents that could ignite organic material. A creature intelligent enough to observe that proximity to fire meant warmth and safety, and that fire could be moved and maintained, carried as a burning branch from a natural source to a sheltered location, was a creature on the edge of one of the most consequential discoveries in the history of life. Whether the particular group we have been following has made this discovery, we cannot say. We are working at the boundaries of what the evidence allows. But imagine for tonight, in the spirit of this gentle speculative journey that they have. Imagine that the overhang is not entirely dark as night falls. Imagine that there is a small fire carefully maintained, throwing its modest light against the limestone ceiling, casting the faces of the small group into the alternating warmth of flame and the soft shadow that circles around it. Fire changes everything. It changes the length of the usable day, extending the social hours beyond sunset. It changes the risk calculation in relation to predators. Large carnivores are deeply reluctant to approach fire, and have been throughout their evolutionary history, because fire is one of the few things that a predator's learned behavior toolkit has no good response to. It changes warmth, the nighttime temperature in the basin, dropping sharply after sunset in the arid air, becomes something that can be mitigated rather than merely endured, and it changes the quality of time itself. Around a fire, in the dark, with the sky visible overhead and the sounds of the night just beyond the circle of warmth, something happens to a social group. The boundaries dissolve slightly, the hierarchies that structure the daylight hours relax. Contact increases, bodies pressed close, not just for warmth, but for the something else that warmth carries when it is shared. The vocalizations become quieter, more sustained, less reactive. It is the kind of social environment that, millions of years later, humans will call by 100 different names: gathering, conversation, community, simply being together. But the core of it was already here, already present in these firelit evenings at the edge of the dry basin, long before any of the words existed. Overhead, and this is one of the details that deserves to be said clearly, the sky is extraordinary. There is no artificial light anywhere in the world. There has never been, at this point in history, a single human-made light source bright enough to affect the night sky. Every star that can be seen from this latitude with the naked eye is visible tonight. Every star. The Milky Way hangs overhead, not as the faint suggestion of something that most modern people have only ever glimpsed in photographs, but as a physical presence, a river of light, so dense and so detailed that it seems to have depth, to be something you could almost reach into. The stars move, not quickly enough to watch from moment to moment, but measurably, continuously, in a slow wheel that marks the hours the way nothing else in this landscape can. The constellations rise in the east and travel their arcs and set in the west, and an observer patient enough, or wakeful enough, which is not the same thing, can track the night's progress by their position. We do not know whether the early hominids watching these skies had developed any formal system of star lore. That level of abstraction, of categorizing and naming the patterns in the sky and assigning meaning to them, seems to belong to later developments in cognitive evolution. But watching, simply watching, that requires nothing beyond eyes and attention and the particular quality of mind that can be arrested by something beautiful without needing to explain it. The fire burns lower. It requires tending. Someone must add fuel at intervals to keep it from dying. And this task, like so many of the small maintenance tasks of this kind of life, seems to distribute itself by a kind of informal rotation rather than explicit assignment. One individual stirs, adds a branch. Another adjusts a sleeping position, drawing closer to the warmth. A young one who had been drowsy in someone's lap becomes fully asleep, their breathing slowing and deepening into the total, uncomplicated unconsciousness that children achieve so easily and adults so rarely. The sounds of the night have their own texture. From below, from the canyon, the river can be heard, or rather felt more than heard, a low, continuous presence at the very edge of audibility, a rhythm so steady and so slow that the mind absorbs it without quite noticing, the way the sound of rain on a roof becomes, after a while, indistinguishable from silence. Further out, in the open scrub beyond the ridge, there are sounds of movement, not alarming sounds, nothing moving with the silence and focused intent that means danger, just the ordinary sounds of the night shift, small animals emerging from daytime shelters, insects resuming calls that the heat had silenced, an owl somewhere, making its low inquiry into the dark, and further still from the deep basin, from the vast empty space below, almost nothing. The silence of the salt flats does not carry noise, it absorbs it. The deep basin at night is as quiet as anywhere on earth, a silence that comes not from the absence of sound sources, but from the absence of surfaces to reflect sound. The air itself too thin and too dry to carry much of anything over distance. But occasionally, not often, and not predictably, which is part of what makes it memorable, a wind rises in the basin. Not a wind from the surface, blowing across the plateau, but a different kind, a thermal shift, a column of air moving upward from the warmer basin floor, as the surface above cools, channeled through the canyon systems and vented upward past the rim with a low, sustained note that is less a sound than a vibration, felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. When this happens, the group around the fire stirs, not in alarm, in attention, heads turn, eyes open. The sound from the deep basin is recognized for what it is: wind, just wind, and after a moment, the attention releases and the warmth reasserts itself and the drift back towards sleep resumes. The fire settles into its later configuration, not the active, bright flames of an energetically burning fire, but the deep, slowly pulsing glow of coals, a different quality of light that is somehow even more restful than the flames were. Coals give a warmer, redder light. They do not flicker so much. They are quieter. They are the light of a fire that has done its work and is now simply being itself, slowly returning to the darkness from which the wood was borrowed. One by one, the members of the group find the boundary of sleep. It is not the sudden unconsciousness of a person who falls asleep mid-sentence with the lights on. It is a gradual recession, the slow withdrawal of attention from the outer world inward, a settling of the breath, a relaxing of the muscles that hold the body upright against gravity. The eyes do not so much close as simply stop receiving the outer world as information worth processing. The fire is there, the stars are there, the sounds of the canyon and the basin are there, all of it remains, but the small group, one by one, goes elsewhere. Consider for a moment what the body does in these last few minutes before sleep. The muscles that have worked all day, the legs that climbed canyon walls, the hands that dug roots from hard soil, the shoulders that carried and lifted and pulled, begin to release the tension they have been holding since before dawn. That release does not happen all at once. It is gradual, like water draining through a slow sieve. One muscle, then another. The feet, which have been bearing weight for hours, seem to sink slightly into the ground as the last unconscious guarding of the tendons lets go. The jaw, which holds itself clenched through effort and alertness more than most people realize, eases open just slightly. The brow, which has been faintly furrowed since the first light of morning, against the sun, against the wind, against the constant stream of information that a waking mind processes without pause, smooths itself out, returning to the neutral expression of a face that has nothing to guard against. The breath slows. It always slows last, as though the breath knows it has the most work to do and is reluctant to reduce its pace before everything else has settled. But eventually it does slow. The long exhale becomes longer. The pause between exhale and inhale becomes a beat, then 2 beats. Then the kind of unhurried suspension that suggests a body that is no longer bracing for what comes next. This is ancient. This moment, this specific physical progression from waking tension to sleeping ease has been happening in creatures built roughly like these for tens of millions of years. Long before the Mediterranean dried up, long before the first hominid stood upright on the African savanna, animals with nervous systems complex enough to need rest were moving through this same transition every night, in every landscape, in every season. You are moving through it now. Whatever they dream and the structures of the sleeping brain that produce dreaming were already present in creatures at this level of development, as they are present in dogs and horses and many other mammals we cannot know. We cannot follow them there. But there is something in the image of dreaming creatures lying in the orange warmth of a small fire at the rim of an enormous emptiness that is, in its own strange way, deeply moving. Beyond the overhang, the basin settles into its deepest quiet. The thermal winds that moved through the canyon an hour ago have stilled. The night birds that called at dusk have gone silent, or retreated to distances where their voices cannot carry. Even the river, still audible in that subliminal way, seems to find a quieter register after midnight, not because it is actually flowing more slowly, but because the air is so still that the sound it makes travels differently, less reflected. more absorbed by the rock and soil on either side. The salt flats, miles below and miles away, are doing something that no sleeping creature can witness. The extreme temperature drop of the desert night, the air that bakes to 130 degrees Fahrenheit or more during the day, falling to 50 or 60 degrees in the small hours before dawn, is causing the mineral surface of the flats to contract. The halite crystals that expanded imperceptibly in the heat are pulling back. And as they do, the surface cracks and resettles with small sounds, like the ticking of a cooling engine. If you were standing on the salt flat at this hour, which nothing large and warm-blooded is doing, you would hear the basin itself breathing, a slow mineral respiration, the crust of the earth adjusting to the cold. The stars overhead continue their silent rotation. They are the same stars that will be overhead in 5 million years, when the Mediterranean has been full of water for millions of years, and the descendants of these small creatures have covered the earth with cities and roads and arguments about the nature of existence. The stars do not change on the timescales of anything biology cares about. Orion rises in the same quarter of the sky. The sweep of the Milky Way holds its position relative to everything else. Whatever is happening on the surface of this small planet, seas forming and vanishing, species rising and going extinct, ice ages coming and receding, the stars look down on it with the same steady indifference they have maintained for billions of years. There is something quieting about that. Something that puts the urgency of any single moment, any single life, any single worry into a perspective so large that urgency itself starts to seem like a kind of misunderstanding. The basin will flood, the sea will return. The creatures sleeping in this overhang will become, in the endless branching of evolution, something unrecognizable. All of that is coming. All of it is already determined by the physics and geology and biology of a world that moves too slowly for any individual life to witness. But right now, in this moment, none of that is happening. Right now there is only the fire's last warmth, and the slow breath of sleeping creatures, and the stars, and the immense and peaceful silence of the deepest dry basin on earth. They are so small, the overhang is so small, the fire is so small, and the world that surrounds them, the deep basin, the salt flats, the ancient lakes, the canyon rivers, the salt-crusted desert floor stretching away for hundreds of miles in every direction, is so extraordinarily, indifferently large. And yet in this small warmth, in this circle of breathing bodies and fading fire, there is something that will outlast everything else in this story. Something that will persist through the coming of the flood and the filling of the sea and the millions of years of geological change that follow. Something that is, in the most literal sense possible, the ancestor of the warmth you are feeling right now, wherever you are, in whatever darkness surrounds your own small light. The need to be together, the need for warmth, the need for the sound of another breathing nearby as the world goes dark. That is as old as the basin itself, and older. The night deepens over the dry Mediterranean. The stars move in their ancient pattern. The basin below holds its silence like a secret it has been keeping for millions of years. The fire at the overhang breathes down to its coals, and the world for this hour is very still. In the next part of our journey, we will go further into the basin, to the strangest and most remote of its ecosystems, to the place where the first hints of change begin to appear in the geology, in the landscape, in the slow, vast processes that will eventually bring the sea crashing back through the gap at Gibraltar. But that is for later. For now, the night is enough, the stars are enough, the warmth is enough. Let your breathing slow down the rest of the way. Let the sounds of this ancient world be the only sounds. The river is far below, the wind has gone still, the fire is almost dark. Somewhere out beyond the western edge of the basin, beyond the ridgeline and the plateau and the scrub-covered slopes, beyond the hills that stack up like layers of old paper into the mountain ranges that define the far horizon, there is an ocean. You cannot see it from the basin, you cannot hear it, you cannot smell it. The distance is too great, the terrain between here and there too broken, too folded by the same tectonic forces that built the barrier that closed the ancient gateway in the first place. If you walked west from the deepest part of the empty basin, climbing up through the canyon systems to the plateau rim, crossing the plateau, descending the far side, crossing mountains and valleys and more mountains, you would eventually reach a coast. You would reach a shoreline where the land drops into deep blue water, and the horizon bends away in every direction. And the smell of salt spray is nothing like the smell of the salt flats in the basin behind you, because this is not concentrated brine, not the mineral residue of an evaporating inland sea, but the full, living, restless salt of a real ocean. The Atlantic. It is there. It has always been there, throughout all the long, dry centuries of the empty Mediterranean. It did not care that the basin behind the barrier had dried up. It did not care that the gateway had closed. It went on doing what oceans do, responding to the gravitational pull of the moon, moving in its vast gyres, evaporating water into clouds that fell as rain thousands of miles away, circulating heat from the tropics toward the poles in currents so massive that they influence the climate of entire continents. The Atlantic does not know about the Mediterranean. It does not notice its absence. It simply continues as it has continued for tens of millions of years in its enormous and entirely self-contained way. But something is happening between the Atlantic and the closed gateway. It has been happening for a long time, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the grinding inevitability of tectonic forces operating on timescales that make human history look like an afternoon. The same plates whose collision closed the gateway are still moving. The African plate continues its slow push northward. The European plate flexes and bends in response, and in the region of what will one day be called the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow neck of land separating the Atlantic from the empty basin, the ground is not entirely stable, has never been entirely stable. Rock is strong. This is one of the things we know intuitively and rely on without thinking. The ground beneath our feet is solid. The cliffs at the edge of the sea will stand for our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children and the lifetimes of many generations beyond that. Rock is strong, but rock is not permanent. Given enough time, given the right combination of forces, the slow creep of tectonic movement, the erosion of rain and rivers, the thermal cracking of daily temperature cycles, the dissolution of limestone by slightly acidic groundwater rock yields. It always eventually yields. At the Western Gateway, the rock is yielding, not in any way that could be observed from one year to the next, or from one century to the next. Not in any way that any living creature in the world at this time could detect, because the scale on which it is happening is so far beyond the scale of a biological life that the two scales simply cannot connect. But geologically, in the language of erosion rates and sediment deposits and the patient arithmetic of stone giving way to water, the barrier at Gibraltar is thinning. The Atlantic is not pressing against it in the way that water presses against a dam. It is doing something far slower and far more certain. It is dissolving the edges, wearing down the lowest points, filling the microscopic fractures with water that freezes and thaws and expands and contracts, reaching through the rock like roots through soil, year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium, making itself a path. The basin does not know this. The creatures living along the canyon margins of the dry basin, the early hominids at their overhang, the horses on the salt flat margins, the cats watching from shadow, do not know this. How could they? The process is happening hundreds of miles away through solid rock, at a rate too slow for any biological time frame to register. They go about their days in the way they have always gone about their days, because there is no signal, no warning, no change in the quality of the air or the temperature of the mornings, or the behavior of the rivers that would suggest anything is different. But if you were to take a position above all of it, above the basin, above the barrier, above the Atlantic, and the dry land between them, and compress time enough to watch centuries pass like minutes, you would begin to see it. A slight darkening at the lowest points of the western barrier. A wet seam in the rock that was not wet before. A trickle of water that appears after a storm and does not quite disappear between storms. A seam that widens almost imperceptibly over decades and then centuries, as the water finds each weakness in the rock and works it, and works it, and works it, and works it. The ocean is coming, it does not hurry, it does not need to. There is a kind of patience in water that has no equivalent in living things. Living things are always in some relationship with urgency. The urgency of hunger, of reproduction, of survival, of the clock that every organism carries at the cellular level, ticking off the finite number of divisions before the end. Water has none of this. Water simply flows toward the lowest available point. And if that point is blocked, it waits, it seeps. It finds the hairline crack and enters it, and given enough time, widens it. It does not experience frustration. It does not accelerate out of impatience. It simply continues. And in continuing, it changes everything it touches. The Atlantic at the western gateway is touching the barrier very slightly in the way that water always touches the boundary of what confines it. And the barrier, made of rock that is ancient but not invulnerable, is responding the way rock always responds to water, slowly, and eventually, completely. None of the creatures in the basin know, but we know, and knowing it, knowing what is coming, changes the quality of everything we have been describing. The morning routines of the early hominids in their canyon, the foraging, the river descents, the midday rest, the firelit evenings under the stars, all of it continues exactly as it has continued for thousands of generations. The basin is still dry. The salt flats still glitter. The isolated lakes still pulse with their strange microbial life in the deepest, hottest parts of the interior. The rivers still carry their cold, faithful water down from the northern highlands and lose themselves in the vast emptiness below. All of this continues. But it will not continue forever. Somewhere in the west, the rock is wet. A seam has opened. The Atlantic is patient, and the Atlantic is very, very large. Let us walk to the western edge of the basin. Not to witness anything dramatic, there is nothing dramatic to witness yet. The thinning of the barrier is not visible to the eye. The water that has found its way through is, at this stage, nothing more than a damp stain on rock, a slightly wetter patch of ground on the Atlantic-facing side of the lowest point of the barrier. If you pressed your hand against the rock, it would come away damp. That is all. But stand here for a moment anyway. Face west. The Atlantic is out there, beyond the hills that rise behind the barrier, its surface catching the late afternoon light. You cannot see the ocean, but on the right kind of day, a day when the wind is from the west, when the air is clear and the humidity is just right, you might almost imagine that you can smell it, that faint, complex living smell of open ocean. Salt, yes, but not the dead. Mineral salt of the evaporated basin. Something with organic notes in it. Something that carries the trace of the vast biological engine of an open sea. Millions of square miles of photosynthesizing plankton and decomposing organic matter and the metabolic byproducts of the entire food web of an ocean. Or perhaps that is only imagination. Perhaps the distance is too great. Perhaps the barrier between here and the Atlantic coast is thick enough to block even the smell. It does not matter. The ocean is there, and the rock between here and there is wet. Meanwhile, in the basin behind us, in the world of the dry Mediterranean that we have been exploring, life continues in its patient, adapted rhythms. The generations of early hominids who sheltered in the canyon overhangs have, over the long span of time we are considering, themselves changed in ways too slow for any individual to notice. The pressures of this particular landscape, the extremes of heat and cold, the need to cover distances between water sources, the cognitive demands of navigating a complex and varied environment are, in their silent way, shaping the biology of the creatures they are being applied to. Not dramatically, not quickly but surely. A trait that makes a creature slightly better at finding water in an arid landscape will, over enough generations, become slightly more common. A social structure that proves slightly more effective at protecting the young through the dangerous night will spread through a population over centuries. The intelligence that can map a canyon system, remember which spring is reliable in which month, anticipate the behavior of a predator on the basis of sound and wind direction, that intelligence, or rather the capacity for it, is being gradually selected for by the very harshness of the world that the dry basin represents. The empty Mediterranean, in other words, is not only a landscape that these creatures are living in. It is a force that is, in the slowest and most indirect of ways, helping to make them what they will eventually become. The pressures of aridity and distance, and the need to navigate a complex, varied extreme environment, are contributing their small increment to the long evolutionary process that will, millions of years later, produce the creature that is listening to this story in the dark. You owe something to the dry basin, more than you might expect. The afternoon on the western rim fades. The light that falls across the barrier rocks, the rocks that are, unbeknownst to anything living, wet on the far side, turns the familiar amber of late day. Shadows pool in the hollows of the limestone. The temperature drops 2 or 3 degrees as the sun passes behind the ridgeline, from somewhere below, from the scrubby slope that descends from this western rim toward the interior of the basin, the sound of movement. Something large, a horse perhaps, or a small group of horses, picking its way through the sparse vegetation, heading in the direction of a water source that it knows, by routes it has been walking its entire life, is somewhere in that direction. The horse does not pause at the western rim. It has no business here, nothing to eat in the bare rock, no water to drink. It moves through without stopping, its hooves making the particular sound that hooves make on hard limestone, a clear, hollow knock that carries further than it should in the dry air, and then it is gone, down the slope, back into the interior of the basin that is all it has ever known. The rim is empty again. The rock is wet. The ocean is patient. Here is how the Mediterranean Sea came back. Not with a crack like thunder, not with a wall of water roaring across the landscape, drowning everything before it in an instant. That is the image we tend to reach for, because we are creatures who think in human timescales, and on human timescales, catastrophes are sudden. But the return of the Mediterranean, the event geologists call the Zanclean flood, was catastrophic only in the geological sense of the word. A large and irreversible change that happened quickly by geological standards, which is a standard so different from human experience that the words quickly and slowly lose their normal meaning. The best current scientific estimates suggest that the Mediterranean basin refilled over a period of somewhere between a few hundred years and a few thousand years. Some models suggest that the initial rate of water entry, once the barrier was breached, was extraordinary, cascading in at volumes that are almost impossible to express in ordinary language, the equivalent of dozens of Niagara Falls pouring simultaneously into the basin through a breach that widened rapidly as the flow carved it larger. Other models suggest a somewhat more gradual process. The details are still debated, because the evidence buried beneath miles of water and sediment, readable only through cores drilled from the seafloor and geophysical instruments that sense density and composition through rock, is fragmentary. But however fast it happened in absolute terms, the beginning was slow. Every ending has a long approach, and so did this one. Before the breach opened wide enough for the ocean to pour through in any volume, there was a period perhaps centuries long of seepage. The barrier at Gibraltar was not a dam with a clear and sudden failure point. It was a gradient of rock of varying hardness and thickness, yielding unevenly, opening in some places faster than others. The first significant flow of Atlantic water into the dry basin was not a river. It was more like the way water enters a basement through a failing wall, not all at once, not through a single clean breach, but in 100 small ways simultaneously, through every weakness in the structure, finding every path of least resistance. The water that entered first was not fresh. The Atlantic is salt water, and the channels it found through the barrier rock were narrow enough that the water moved slowly, giving it time to interact with the minerals it was flowing through, picking up additional dissolved salts. By the time it emerged on the basin side of the barrier, it was a dense, salt-heavy brine, heavier than normal seawater, and it sank immediately when it reached the basin interior, flowing down the slopes and collecting in the lowest available points. The first thing that changed in the basin was the deepest thing, the residual brine lakes at the very bottom of the Mediterranean depression. Those ancient, concentrated, barely alive pockets of hypersaline water that had been sitting in the deepest parts of the basin for hundreds of thousands of years were the first to receive the new water. Slowly, incrementally, their levels began to rise. The shorelines that had been fixed for so long they had grown their own mineral crusts began, almost imperceptibly, to advance. A shoreline that moved a foot a year would not be visible from one visit to the next, but over a decade it would have moved 10 feet. Over a century, 100 feet. Over 1,000 years it would have moved more than a mile. The salt flats that had been the floor of the basin for so long began, from their edges, to disappear underwater. Nothing dramatic accompanied this. That is the most important thing to hold on to as we walk through these changes. Nothing in the experience of a creature living at this time would have been dramatic. A creature with a lifespan of perhaps 20 or 30 years, living near the margins of the basin, would have seen none of the change in its own lifetime. Perhaps the elders in its group, if they survived long enough and ranged widely enough, might have noticed that certain landmarks near the deep basin margins were slightly different from how they had been in the memories passed down from generations before. A particular rock formation that was described as being at the edge of the basin floor was now, somehow, further from the edge. A route down into the canyon that had always ended at a dry, crusted flat now ended, in its final descent, at something damp. But this kind of noticing, this comparison of the present moment to the remembered descriptions of a distant past, requires a cognitive capacity that we cannot confidently assign to the creatures living in the basin at this time. They may have noticed changes within their own lifetimes. They may have remembered water holes that dried up, routes that became impassable, familiar landscapes that shifted. This kind of observational memory is present in many animals, not only in humans. But the connection between a slowly rising water level in the deep basin and the tectonic processes happening at Gibraltar, that connection was beyond anyone alive at the time to make. They simply adapted. This is what living things do. It is perhaps the most fundamental thing living things do. More fundamental even than reproduction, because without adaptation there is no context in which reproduction matters. When a resource disappears, they move toward the next available resource. When a route is blocked, they find another route. When the landscape changes, they change with it, not through any conscious decision, but through the ancient and reliable mechanism of behavior, adjusting to environment in real time, individual by individual, generation by generation. The water, meanwhile, continued its patient work. At the western gateway, the initial seepage had widened. The combined forces of the flowing water itself, which erodes stone in proportion to the volume and speed of its flow, and which was therefore eroding faster as more water came through, and the continued geological adjustments of the region were enlarging the breach. What had been a damp seam became a trickle. What became a trickle became a stream. And as the breach widened, the rate of flow increased, and as the rate of flow increased, the erosion accelerated, and as the erosion accelerated, the breach widened further. This is a feedback process. Once it begins in earnest, it does not slow down. The physics of water carving through rock do not have a natural moderating force. Once the process has reached a certain threshold, the breach gets larger, the flow gets stronger. The flow getting stronger makes the breach larger faster. This is why geologists, even those who favor the more gradual models of the Mediterranean refilling, acknowledge that once the initial barrier was fully overcome, the rate of filling would have been staggering by any normal intuition. But we are not there yet. We are in the slow time, the centuries of seepage and gradual advance, when the world was changing in ways that no living creature could register within the span of its own life. And in that slow time, the basin was beginning to transform. The edges of the basin were the first to show it. The river systems that drained into the basin, the Rhone and the Proto-Nile and the others, had been carrying their water into a dry or near-dry basin for hundreds of thousands of years, spreading into fans of sediment at the canyon mouths, their flow disappearing into the porous, salt-encrusted floor long before it reached the deepest parts of the interior. Now, as the water level in the deep basin began its slow rise, a new dynamic was establishing itself. The rivers were beginning to encounter something at their outlets, not a wall, not anything sudden, just a slight resistance, a backing up of water that had not been there before, a pooling where the canyon floor met the basin, a puddle at first, then a small pond. Then, over decades, something that would have to be called a lake, a shallow, murky, sediment-heavy lake at the junction of the river canyon and the basin floor, expanding slowly as the basin water level rose and the rivers continued to bring their water to it. These marginal lakes were nothing like the deep, concentrated brine remnants in the center of the basin. They were fresh or close to fresh fed, primarily by river water, with mineral content much lower than the hypersaline interior. And because they were fresh, they were able to support life in a way the interior brine pools never could. Within decades of a marginal lake establishing itself, it would begin to be colonized. Aquatic plants from the river systems, seeds and rhizomes carried down by the current, would find the still shallow margins and take hold. Insects would follow the plants. Frogs, if there were any in the river system above, would follow the insects. Fish would spread from the rivers into the new water body, finding, in the expansion of their habitat, a bonanza of new space and new food. These small transitional lakes were, in their way, among the most productive ecosystems in the entire basin. They occupied the boundary between two worlds, the river ecosystem and the expanding basin, and they benefited from the resources of both. The sediment that the rivers brought down was rich in minerals. The shallow, warm water heated quickly in the sun, producing the algal growth that forms the base of every freshwater food chain. The marginal vegetation was dense and varied, providing habitat structure that a completely open water body lacks. The birds found them first, as birds always do. Wading birds that had been working the river margins began to appear at the new lake shores, stalking through the shallows with the precise suspended attention of creatures that hunt by sight in clear shallow water. Ducks and geese, if the latitude was right, settled on the open water. Herons stood at the margins like grey statues, occasionally striking with the terrifying speed that makes their everyday patience seem deceptive, and the early hominids, they noticed. Of course they noticed. A new water source, a new concentration of food, a new richness in a landscape that had been demanding and spare for as long as any memory carried. This was not something that a social creature with the intelligence to build a mental map of its territory would miss. New routes would have been discovered, by accident at first and then by intention, leading down to the new lakeshore. New behaviors would have developed around the new resource because behavior in social animals is not just individual. It is shared, communicated, transmitted. One individual finds a good place, others follow. The information spreads. The marginal lakes were, in this way, already beginning to be incorporated into the world of the basin's inhabitants, before the basin had changed in any way they could consciously recognize. The lake was simply there, and it was good, and they went to it. Higher up on the basin margins, on the plateau where the early hominids spent their nights and their midday rests, the changes were more subtle. The climate was shifting, slowly, as the growing body of water at the basin center began to influence the local weather. Water bodies moderate temperature. They store heat in summer and release it in winter, making the air above them and around them less extreme than the fully continental climate of a completely dry basin. As the water returned, the most severe summer temperatures on the basin margins began to ease, incrementally, towards something slightly more tolerable. Precipitation was changing too. Water evaporating from the new lakes, and from the increasingly large body of water accumulating in the basin center, was rising into the atmosphere and falling, somewhere, not always locally, but somewhere in the regional system as rain. The basin was beginning, very slowly and in the most preliminary way, to participate in the regional water cycle rather than simply receiving its deficit. The vegetation responded. Plants that had been confined to the most sheltered, moisture-retaining microclimates began to expand their ranges slightly, a few feet here, a few yards there, moving into ground that had been too dry to colonize before. The sparse scrub on the upper basin margins became, in places, slightly less sparse. Small stands of trees appeared in hollows where water ran off the plateau and collected before draining away. The landscape was not yet transformed. It would not be transformed in any one creature's lifetime or in 10 lifetimes. But it was changing. The world of the dry basin was becoming something slightly less dry. Let us find the group we have been following, the early hominids in their canyon overhang, and check in on them on an evening somewhere deep in the long transition when the change has been going on for perhaps a few hundred years. From the outside, their evening looks much as it always has. The fire at the overhang, the small group settling in, the young ones finding their positions close to the adults they are most comfortable with. The same wide sky overhead, the same stars beginning to appear as the last light leaves the western horizon, but the canyon below is different in one small way. The river, which always ran at the base of the canyon, is slightly wider tonight than it would have been a century ago. Nothing dramatic, the difference is perhaps a few feet, and it would not be remarkable to anyone who had not been watching this particular river for a century, which no living creature has. But the river is wider. The water table along its banks has risen. The vegetation on the canyon floor is a little denser, a little greener, more varied in the species it includes. And at the canyon's mouth, at the place where the canyon opens out and the terrain flattens toward the basin interior, there is now something that was not there before, a pond, small, shallow, fringed with tall grasses and the first thin stands of reed. The water is turbid with sediment, not yet clear, not yet the settled, biologically rich water body it will eventually become. But it is there. It is water in a place where before there was only dry sediment and mineral crust. The fire settles. The coals pulse. One of the young ones, who ranged further than usual this afternoon, and came back with something held carefully in cupped hands, something that when examined proved to be a small fish from the new pond at the canyon mouth, flopping with desperate vitality before going still, has fallen asleep with the expression of satisfaction that is, in all its essentials, as legible as any expression a human face makes. The fish was good, the pond is good, the world is changing, and it is good. If you are still awake and listening, welcome to the slower part of the night, where the story begins to turn. This is the moment to get truly comfortable. If you have been enjoying this journey through deep time, a gentle like before you drift off means the world, and if you want to find your way back here, subscribing will bring you to the next story. Now, let the evening at the overhang fade. Let the fire go to coals. The water is coming, and it is coming quietly. Here is the last thing the dry basin ever knew as itself. A morning, let us say a morning in the season that, in this latitude, passes for spring. The temperature is still cool enough at dawn to see your breath if you breathe slowly into the air above the canyon rim. The sky to the east is the particular pale orange that comes just before the sun clears the ridge, a color so specific to this hour and this latitude that seeing it produces, in any creature that has watched enough sunrises, a physical response, a slight quickening, a readiness, the body understanding before the mind catches up that the light is about to change. On the plateau above the canyon, the sparse vegetation holds drops of dew. There is slightly more moisture in the air than there was 50 years ago, slightly more than there was a century ago. The incremental contribution of all those new lakes and all that new evaporation from the growing body of water to the west. The drops catch the first light and hold it for a moment, each one a tiny lamp before the sun climbs fully over the ridge and the dew begins to burn off. In the canyon below, the river runs. It is wider now than it has been in thousands of years. The pond at the canyon mouth has grown. It is properly a lake now, perhaps half a mile across, with water clear enough in its deeper sections to see the bottom, fringed by vegetation so dense and so various that it provides habitat for more species of bird than the entire surrounding plateau combined. The hominids know this lake well. They have incorporated it into their seasonal routine certain times of year when the lake's resources are at their richest. The birds most abundant and most accessible, the fish gathering near the shallows in concentrations that make catching them almost easy. The world of the basin is already more hospitable than it was. The worst of the extremity has begun to ease. The climate moderation that comes with more water in the system, the slightly increased rainfall, the slightly less savage summers, these changes are real and felt, even if they are not understood in any explicit way. And to the west, the gateway is fully open, not partly open. Not the hairline crack of centuries ago, not the seeping damp patch, not the trickle, not the stream, open. The rock that had separated the Atlantic from the empty basin for nearly 6 million years is gone, or rather, what remains of it is deep underwater, buried under the flow of a cascade that has no equivalent in any other chapter of Earth's history. The water that is entering the basin now is doing so with a force and volume that renders every other river on the planet insignificant by comparison. The breach at Gibraltar, carved by its own flow into an ever wider channel, is delivering Atlantic water to the basin at a rate that scientists who have modeled it struggle to express in ordinary terms. Imagine every river on Earth flowing simultaneously into the same place, and you are approaching the right order of magnitude, though even that comparison falls short. But here is the thing about that cascade, the thing that is so easy to miss when we talk about its scale and speed. In the basin itself, the rise is still, by the measure of any individual life, slow. Even at the most extreme estimates of the flood's rate, the water level in the deepest parts of the basin would have risen on the order of feet per day, perhaps faster in some models, but not the instantaneous wall of water that the word flood implies to a modern listener. A creature standing at the edge of the expanding water would have seen it advancing, visibly advancing on a timescale that a human or proto-human eye could register, advancing in a way that was clearly not a seasonal fluctuation or a rainstorm's aftermath, but a genuine and sustained change in the world. But not a wall, not a roar, something quieter than that. Something more like watching a tide come in that simply does not stop. The valley fills first, the lowest parts of the basin, the deep sub-basins that had been dry or nearly dry for millions of years, that had known nothing but salt and silence, become the first true sea. Not a sea yet in the full sense, not connected to the global ocean system, but a vast inland water body of Atlantic water, saline and cold, spreading across the flat basin floor with a patience that mirrors the patience of the ocean that feeds it. The salt flats that had defined the basin's identity for so long, that had glittered in the summer sun and contracted in the winter cold, and supported their impossible communities of extreme adapted microorganisms and salt-tolerant plants, disappear. They go in stages. The drier, higher elevation parts of the salt flat hold out longer, becoming islands first, peninsulas, isolated patches of white in an advancing grey-blue, and then they too go under. The brine lakes that had been the last concentrated remnant of the original Mediterranean. The hypersaline, red-tinted, almost dead bodies of water in the deepest parts of the basin are diluted. Their extreme chemistry, built up over hundreds of thousands of years of concentration through evaporation, is slowly overwhelmed by the volume of Atlantic water entering from the west. The microorganisms that had evolved to survive in those extreme conditions are, in a very real sense, faced with a different kind of extremity now, the extremity of their world becoming less extreme, of the chemistry that they were built for being gradually replaced by something merely oceanic. Some of them survive the transition, others do not. The deep basin, after its long period as one of the most hostile environments on Earth, is in the process of becoming something more ordinary in the sense of more like everywhere else. More ordinary in the sense of being connected eventually to the vast biological community of the global ocean. Life, when it enters this new sea, will come primarily from the Atlantic. Fish that have spent their lives adapted to oceanic conditions, pushed through the widening gateway by the pressure of the flow, will find themselves in a new and expanding habitat. They will adapt, or their descendants will adapt, over generations and centuries, to the particular conditions of this enclosed basin, its temperature, its salinity, its circulation patterns, its seasonal rhythms. This is the beginning of the Mediterranean Sea's biological community as we know it today. The fish that swim in the Mediterranean today are the descendants of Atlantic immigrants that entered through the Zanclean Breach. The ecosystems of the modern Mediterranean, the Posidonia meadows, the rocky reefs, the open pelagic zones are built on the foundation of that original Atlantic colonization, and the early hominids. This is the question that circles back to where we began. Because at the beginning of this journey, before the salt flats and the canyon rivers and the firelit evenings and the long geological meditation on the patience of water, the question was always implicitly there. What happened to the creatures who lived in the basin when the sea came back? What did the flood mean to them? The honest answer is, we do not know in detail. The geological evidence for the hominid presence in the Mediterranean basin during this period is fragmentary. Fossils from this time and this region are rare, because the depositional environments that preserve fossils well, quiet lake sediments, cave floors, sheltered riverbanks, are precisely the kinds of environments that the flood would have submerged and reworked and ultimately buried under miles of marine sediment. But we can reason about it. We can look at what we know about early hominids' mobility, their intelligence, their responsiveness to environmental change, and make some informed inferences. The creatures we have been following, and their kind throughout the basin, were not stationary. They had never been stationary. Their entire way of life was built around movement, following resources, responding to conditions, adjusting routes and ranges as the landscape demanded. A rising water level, even one rising at the speed of the Zanclean flood, was something they could in principle respond to. Not by understanding it, not by predicting it, but by doing what all mobile creatures do in the face of changing conditions, moving, uphill, always uphill. As the water advanced, the available dry land retreated toward the basin margins, toward the plateau rims and the mountain slopes above them. The routes that had led down into the canyon for water now led away from water that was, for the first time in this landscape's history, coming to them. The overhangs that had sheltered them at the canyon walls were, as the water rose around them, being incorporated into the margins of something new, not a dry canyon with a river at the bottom but a shoreline, the edge of a sea. This transition would not have been understood. It was not within the cognitive reach of creatures at this stage of development to abstract from rising water levels and a reconfiguring landscape to the conclusion that a sea was forming, but the immediate practical situation that the available dry land was contracting, that the routes to certain resources were flooded, that new routes were needed, and new resources were appearing. All of this was within the behavioral range of creatures who had been navigating a complex and changing landscape for thousands of generations. They moved to the higher margins, to the mountain slopes above the old plateau, to the river valleys further inland, beyond the reach of the advancing water. They carried with them, not in containers, not as written knowledge, but in the accumulating memory of a social group, in behavior patterns passed from one generation to the next, everything they knew about living in this landscape. And some of what they knew was still useful. The plants on the higher slopes, while different from the basin's canyon vegetation, were navigable by the same general intelligence that had learned the canyon. The springs and streams that fed the rivers above the basin were findable by the same orientation skills that had found springs on the plateau. They adapted. They always had. They always would. The sea, meanwhile, was being born. It is a strange thing to say that a sea was born. Seas feel ancient, permanent, geological in the way that means essentially unchanging. But the Mediterranean is, on the timescale of the Earth's history, a young sea. It has been refilled and re-emptied more than once in its long geological life. It may be emptied again. The same tectonic forces that closed the gateway 6 million years ago are still operating, still moving Africa northward, still building the mountains that make up the backbone of the Mediterranean's surrounding landscape. In another few million years, the collision of plates may close the Strait of Gibraltar again, and the basin may begin its slow drying one more time. But that is not today's story. Today's story is the filling, the water coming in, the salt flat turning to sea floor, the canyon mouth turning to bay, the river that ran down into the dry basin turning to estuary and then to inlet, and then to arm of a growing sea. The first creatures to colonize the new Mediterranean from the Atlantic were the smallest, the plankton and the microorganisms, carried passively in the flow of water and finding, in the vast new basin, space and light and nutrients in quantities that must have been, in biological terms, extraordinary. They bloomed, a new sea, with no established ecological hierarchy to suppress a newcomer, is the nearest thing to an open frontier that biology knows. The plankton grew and reproduced and died, and their bodies fell to the new seafloor and began the long process of organic accumulation that would, over millions of years, become the rich organic sediments that define the Mediterranean seafloor. Fish followed, invertebrates. The filter feeders and the grazers and the predators, each arriving in their turn, each finding the ecological niche that their physiology and behavior had prepared them for, establishing themselves in a new sea that was, with each passing century, becoming more complex and more populated, and more like the Mediterranean that exists today. The sea was learning what it was, on the slopes above the old basin, on the hillsides that had once been the plateau rim, looking down over what was now a shoreline instead of a cliff edge above a dry abyss. The early hominids were also learning something new. Or rather, they were encountering something new and responding to it with the same basic tools they had always used. Curiosity, caution, the testing of unknowns against prior knowledge, the incorporation of what worked and the discarding of what did not. The sea was new. It smelled different from anything the basin had offered before, that living, complex, organic salt smell of open water, so different from the mineral hardness of the evaporite plains. It made sounds that the dry basin had never made, the rhythm of waves against the new shoreline, the hiss of water retreating over stone, the low boom of larger swells on exposed rock faces. It produced its own weather, the evaporation from its surface creating moisture in the air that came as morning mist on the slopes above, and eventually as rain, real rain, reliable rain, rain that fell on a schedule more generous than the old arid basin had ever managed. This was better. There is no other word for it. The creation of the Mediterranean Sea was, for the living things that survived the transition and found themselves on its shores, a change for the better. More water, more moderate temperatures, more biological diversity as the marine ecosystem began to produce resources, fish, shellfish, seaweed, all the calories of a coastal ecosystem that had simply not existed in the dry basin. It was not easy. The transition was a displacement, a loss of familiar terrain, a forced movement away from the canyons and the overhangs that had been home for generations. The old world was gone, and the new world required learning, but living things are learners. That is, again, perhaps the most fundamental thing about them. And so the early hominids on the new shores of the Mediterranean began to learn the sea. Shellfish were perhaps the first marine resource they found. Bivalves colonizing the rocky intertidal zones of the new shoreline, mussels and oysters, and the various relatives that have been a coastal food source for as long as hominids have had coasts to live on, were accessible, easy to collect, required no particular technology to consume, and were nutritionally dense in a way that made the effort of reaching them highly worthwhile. Coastal middens, the archaeological rubbish heaps of shellfish-eating peoples, are some of the earliest evidence of marine resource use by early hominids, precisely because shellfish are so abundant, so accessible, and produce such distinctive and preservable remains. Fish were harder. Catching fish without technology is difficult, but not impossible. Tide pools trap fish at low water. Some species school so densely near the surface that driving them toward shore becomes effective. The creativity that the dry basin had demanded, find the resource, find a way to it, did not stop working simply because the landscape had changed. The sea was being incorporated, slowly, incompletely, in ways that left almost no surviving evidence in the archaeological record. But the process was happening. The same intelligence that had mapped canyon systems and remembered seasonal water sources was now mapping tidal rhythms and learning which rocks held shellfish and which stretches of shore produced fish in the right season. The adaptation was underway. The sun is low now over the new sea. This is an evening somewhere in the later stages of the filling. The basin is largely full, the broad open water of the young Mediterranean spreading to every horizon, its surface catching the last light of the day and throwing it back in 1,000 scattered pieces. The smell of it is everywhere, not just on the shore but carried inland on the breeze, reaching the slopes where the hominids have established their new routines on higher ground, a constant, living reminder that the world is different now. At the shoreline itself, the water moves in its new rhythm. The Mediterranean, even full, is not an ocean. It does not have the great swells of the open Atlantic, the long fetch of waves that have traveled thousands of miles before arriving. It has its own rhythms, shorter, closer together, less powerful, more variable depending on the local wind. But they are real waves. They break and retreat over the new shoreline with the ancient, patient regularity that waves have always had, wearing away at the rock below the waterline, shaping the coast into the forms that will, over millions of years, become the Mediterranean coastline that human civilization will later build its history along. At the water's edge, a figure. Small, upright, standing at the exact boundary between land and sea, 1 foot on the wet sand left by the retreating wave, 1 foot on the dry ground above the tide line, looking out over the water. The sun is behind now, the western horizon, a long stripe of amber fading to the blue of early evening. This creature has never seen this view before. None of its kind has. The sea is new, perhaps a few generations old. In the slow time of geological change that this transition represents, and there is no prior cultural memory of standing at a Mediterranean shore, no inheritance of sea knowledge to draw on. This is pure encounter. Pure present-moment confrontation with something vast and new and moving and alive. What does it feel? We cannot know. We are separated from this creature by millions of years and by the gulf of cognitive difference that those years represent. But we can notice something. The posture is not alarmed. The creature is not running. It is standing still, at the edge of the sea, looking at the horizon. And in that posture, in that moment of stillness at the boundary between the old world and the new, there is something that the human brain, even across all that distance and difference, recognizes. Awe, or the closest thing to awe, that this creature's nervous system is capable of producing that full-body quieting, that suspension of the normal forward rush of action and response, that state of being arrested by something larger than the self. It does not last. A wave advances further than the others and reaches the creature's foot, cold and sudden, and the spell breaks. The creature moves back, looks down at the water receding around its foot, looks back at the sea, then turns and moves up the slope, toward the place where others are gathering, toward the smell of a fire that someone has started in a sheltered hollow above the tide line, toward the warmth and the sound of the group. The sea continues. The waves continue. The light continues its slow departure from the western sky, and the first stars appear over the eastern horizon, the same stars, always the same stars, indifferent to the sea below them and the creature that just stood at the water's edge for one moment of wordless encounter with a new world. This is how the Mediterranean was born, not with drama, not with the thunderclap of mythology, but with water finding its way through rock, with an ocean patient enough to wait 6 million years for the barrier to fail, with a landscape transforming so gradually that the creatures living through the transformation experienced not catastrophe, but a long, slow, strange series of days that were each only slightly different from the day before, until one day the difference was total. And the creatures who lived on its shores when the transformation was complete were some of them our ancestors, not directly in a simple lineage, not without millions of years of additional evolution, additional change, additional branching and dying and adapting, but in the deepest sense, the creatures who stood at the edge of the young Mediterranean and looked out over water they had never been taught to expect. Those creatures were us in the making. The Mediterranean that modern humans know, the Mediterranean of ancient Greece and Rome, of Phoenician traders and Byzantine mosaics, and Arabic science and Renaissance art, the sea that cradled so much of what we call Western civilization, the sea that people still sail and swim in and fish in and stand at the edge of on summer evenings and feel, without knowing why they feel it, some deep resonance. That sea began with this, with the Atlantic finding a hairline crack in a ridge of rock, with water choosing its path as water always does. We are, all of us, the inheritors of a flood. Let the evening at the new sea settle around you now. The fire in the hollow above the tide line has burned down to its familiar coals. The group around it has gone quiet in the way that groups go quiet when the long day has used up what the day had to offer and the night has begun to ask for something simpler. Breath, warmth, the weight of a resting body against the earth, the sound of the sea, new and not yet fully understood, carrying from the shore below a sound that will become, over thousands of generations of descendants, so familiar and so deeply embedded in the human nervous system that even people who have never seen the sea will feel something stir in them at the sound of waves. You are lying somewhere right now, in a room, in a bed, in the particular darkness that belongs to your corner of the world tonight. The sea, wherever it is in relation to you, is doing what it has been doing since the Zanclean flood filled the basin, moving, breathing, wearing its patient way into the coastline, one wave at a time, as it has done for 5 million years and will do for however many more millions of years the Strait of Gibraltar stays open. The world we live in was made by water, the shores we stand on, the seas that connect us, the climate that makes our particular corner of the earth what it is. All of it is downstream, in one way or another, from the great geological events that formed and reformed the basins and barriers of the world over deep time. The Mediterranean is one chapter in that story. The Zanclean flood is one sentence in that chapter. and the early creatures who adapted to its margins, who learned the dry basin and then learned the new sea, who carried the knowledge of their landscape from one generation to the next through the long, slow transformation. They are one word in that sentence. A word that eventually became us. That is worth something on a quiet night. To know that the ground beneath everything familiar, beneath the civilizations and the cities and the roads and the particular arrangement of seas and continents that makes the world look the way it does, was made by forces so vast and so patient that human history, in all its noise and urgency, is simply what happened on the surface, while the deep processes continued undisturbed. That is worth something on a quiet night. To know that the ground beneath everything familiar, beneath the civilizations and the cities and the roads and the particular arrangement of seas and continents that makes the world look the way it does, was made by forces so vast and so patient that human history, in all its noise and urgency, is simply what happened on the surface while the deep processes continued undisturbed. There is something restful in that, if you let it be. Think about the creature who stood at the water's edge this evening. Think about what it knew and what it did not know. It did not know that the sea in front of it was new. That 6 million years of absence had preceded its arrival. That an ocean on the other side of a continent had spent all of that time patiently wearing through a ridge of rock to get here. It did not know that the salt flats now beneath the water had once supported its own kind. That the fires that burned on what was now the sea floor had been tended by generations of creatures much like itself. It did not know any of this, and it did not need to. It only needed to know the shoreline, the places where shellfish gathered, the hollow above the tide line where the wind did not reach and a fire could be kept through the night. The sound that the water made when a storm was coming, different from the sound it made on calm evenings. A lower note, more insistent, worth paying attention to. It only needed to know the things that mattered for its particular life, in its particular corner of the world, right now. This is the deepest kind of knowledge, and in some ways the kind we have lost most completely. Not knowledge about, not facts and dates and classifications, but knowledge of. The direct, embodied, unspeakable knowledge of a place that comes only from inhabiting it long enough and attentively enough that its rhythms become your rhythms. Its moods become readable to you the way another person's face becomes readable after years of paying attention. The early hominids on the new Mediterranean shore had this kind of knowledge. Not of the sea, not yet, not for many more generations, but of the land behind the shore, the slopes and the springs and the seasonal patterns of a landscape they had inhabited for as long as their kind's memory reached. They were bringing that knowledge with them into the new world the flood had made, bringing it in the only vessel available to them, themselves, their bodies, their habits, their accumulated behavioral repertoire, their social bonds, their way of moving through the world. It was enough. It has always been enough, because it has always been all there was. The night deepens over the young sea. The stars overhead are beginning their slow descent toward the western horizon, the same motion that has always marked the passage of the night, as reliable as the tide below. On the eastern horizon, nothing yet. The darkness is complete, or as complete as darkness ever is in a clear sky, when the Milky Way hangs overhead in all its unhurried enormity, spilling its ancient light across the water below. The waves continue. Each one is different from the last, a different height, a different sound, breaking in a slightly different place on the shore, but the pattern holds, the rhythm holds. There is no wave that does not follow a wave, no silence between waves that is not followed by sound, no sound that does not resolve back into silence. It is the oldest rhythm on earth, or close to it. The rhythm that the moon and the water have been playing together since there were oceans to move. Somewhere on the slope above the shore, in the hollow where the fire has burned down, the last watcher is drifting toward the edge of sleep. The fire is dark now. The coals have given up their warmth. But the night is not cold. The sea has done that, at least in its slow transformation of the local climate. The nights are milder now. The sleeping group needs less tending, less vigilance against cold than the groups who sheltered in the dry basin above the canyon would have needed on a clear, cold night without a body of water for hundreds of miles in any direction. Small mercies. The sea brought small mercies with it. The watcher's eyes close, the breathing slows, the sound of the waves, which has been in the background of everything since the group descended to the new shore weeks ago, settles into the specific register that the sleeping brain reserves for sounds it has accepted as safe sounds that no longer require monitoring, that can be heard without being listened to. That can become part of the texture of sleep rather than an interruption of it. The sea breathes. The sleeper breathes. They are for this hour in the same rhythm, that deep, slow, dark red pulse of a fire that has given everything it had and is in the last stages of giving back the warmth to the night air around it. In a little while it will be dark there, and the darkness will be complete, and the only light will be the stars overhead, and the faint phosphorescence that the new sea produces on its surface when a wave breaks, a cold blue-green light, chemical and alive. The light of living things being disturbed by moving water. The early hominids on the shore do not have a word for phosphorescence. They do not have a word for the Zanclean flood, or for the Messinian salinity crisis, or for the 5 million-year absence of the sea that preceded its return. They do not have a cosmology that explains to them why the sea is here, or where it came from, or what it means. But they are here, they are on the shore, they are warm and together, and the sea is making its sound, and the stars are overhead, and the coals are breathing their last warmth into the night, and that is enough, that is always enough. You have travelled a long way tonight. From the dry salt flats of the empty basin to the firelit overhang above the canyon. From the shores of hypersaline lakes coloured red by life too small to see to the green margins of the first lakes that formed as the water returned. From the thin crack of a damp seam in Gibraltar rock to the open, breathing, living sea that eventually filled every valley and drowned every salt flat and transformed the world irrevocably into the world we know. You have done this with your eyes closed or nearly closed. You have let the words carry you through deep time the way a river carries a leaf, not pushing, not resisting, just moving with the current of the story until the story found its end at the shore of a new sea, at the edge of a world that was just beginning to understand what it was. The water is still. Your breathing is slow. The world outside your window, wherever your window looks tonight, is doing what it always does in the dark hours, getting on with itself, quietly, without requiring anything from you. You can rest now. If you found something in this journey worth carrying with you into tomorrow, into the rest of your week, then a quiet like before you sleep and subscribe. If you haven't yet, means this kind of storytelling can keep going. It means more long, slow trips into the deep past. More hours of the world telling its own story in its own time, more evenings at the fire's edge, but that is for tomorrow. Tonight, let the sea have the last word. It always has in the end. Long after the fire goes dark, and the group settles into sleep, and the stars complete their rotation, and the first light begins at the eastern edge of the sky, the sea continues. It breathes against the shore. It moves in its currents. It carries on with the vast, patient, endlessly rolling work of being the sea. The same sea that began with a hairline crack in a ridge of rock. The same sea that a small upright creature once stood at the edge of in the last light of evening and looked out over for the first time. The same sea that is somewhere in the world tonight doing what it has always done. Let that be the last thought. The sea breathing. The fire gone to dark. The stars overhead. You resting. That is the whole world tonight. Sleep well.